The idea of today's talk is basically to give you a sort of an overview of obviously it's not an extensive overview of contemporary Indian writers, but what I've tried to do here is to group together pairs of Indian writers that deal with specific Indian themes, okay? Both Indian themes and Indian diaspora themes, okay? And my idea is just to give you an overview, and for those of you who might be interested in doing some further research on Indian topics, well, that's my idea. So it's very didactical, and it's going to be very brief because I've only got 20 minutes and I'm trying to get through about 12 authors, so I'm going to be very brief. So here we have our first author, whose name is Khushwant Singh. He wrote a book called A Train to Pakistan in 1956. One thing that you need to know, anybody who needs to get involved in Indian studies, is that obviously the moment of partition is a very crucial moment in Indian history, and it's also a theme it's a recurring theme within Indian literature. So A Train to Pakistan is written in 1956, and what it does is what Khushwant Singh does is he creates this fictional village which is called Mano Manjira. I'm not know if I'm pronouncing that rightly, but anyway. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to create a microcosm of the events that surround the partition, because as we all know, it was one of the biggest migratory moments in the history of humanity, with over 10 million people moving to and from what is now Pakistan, what at the time was also called East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh, and India. And also the communal violence that propitiated. So what Singh is trying to do is he's trying to understand through his fictional world. He's trying to look for some of the answers, and some of the answers that because Singh is quite an interesting character, because he was a trained lawyer and barrister. He trained in London. He's been a filmmaker. He's been a member of the Indian Parliament. His column in the Indian Times was syndicated. He was very kind of sarcastic, ironical. He was a profound atheist. So he was a high-profile figure in India, and very much, if you like, even though very Indian, very very controversial. So what Khushwant Singh, one of the things that he transmits to us in this particular novel is how both sides, if you like, of the religious divide were involved within this communal violence, and also how the ordinary man within India, if we would like to the unscheduled castes, or simply just the ordinary people, were outside of the whole political maneuverings that happened in and around independence. So the characters, one of the heroes of A Train to Pakistan is Jugat, and he's more or less an illiterate, emotional kind of guy, but he's the actual person who actually tries to save, because the book's title is called A Train to Pakistan, because as we know, what was happening was there were continual movements of millions of people across these new borders, and the moments where these trains came into the station was the moments when the communal violence happened. Some figures have that as up to 1 million people dying as a direct result of that. So that's an open wound in Indian history. So what Singh tells us is that these people were outside of history, and as far as they was concerned, the transfer of power from British colonialism to the new Indian state, for them was just a transfer of an old colonial master to a new upper class caste-based society. They were outside of the power. So in that sense, what Singh presents us with is very much a realist vision of that historical moment. Okay, so now, and of course, what he's trying to do is to look at one event, at that single event, from multiple perspectives. As his name tells us, he himself is Sikh, and he was from a place which formed a part of the Punjab, which at the time would have been part of colonial India, and then afterwards formed a part now of what is nowadays Pakistan. Of course, we have to talk about Salman Rushdie. So what I've done is I've paired A Train to India with Rushdie's Midnight's Children. Okay, so on a formal level, while Khushwant Singh looks at the event, or from on a formal level, from very much from a, if we like, a sort of a 19th century realist, Indian realism. If you were to initiate any studies in Indian literature, well, you really have to take on board Salman Rushdie, for the simple reason that his Midnight's Children is transformative on a formal level of how in the Indian experience is narrated. Okay, so again, even though we can see a train to Pakistan as being allegorical, in the case of Salman Rushdie, the phenomenal significance of that novel is how he creates the sort of chrysol, he condenses the whole chrysol of and the multiplicity of identities that India is, and he condenses it into one locus, a narrative locus. And also on a formal level of language, what he does is he creates a transformation from what we could understand as being an inherited literary culture through European languages, in this case British culture, English literature with a capital E. And what he does is he Indianizes it. He creates, if you like, a Bollywood masala. And what so for Indians who had up until then were engaged with Indian literature, Rushdie was like a bombshell. It was like maybe perhaps something similar to what James Joyce did with literature in the 20th century. That's the kind of phenomenal effect it has. So as a student of Indian literature, we have to look at Rushdie as being sort of the founding father. And of course, the actual book itself, the book's title, for those of you who haven't studied it, Midnight's Children is an allegory on the birth of the Indian nation. Okay, because it takes the character Salim is born on midnight, August 15th, 1947, which is the formal transferal of power in Shimla from the British colonial state to the new Indian state. Okay, right. But so I think I'll skip over that, because I think Rushdie is pretty much he's very much a high profile figure. Yes. Oh no, that's a total. No, yeah, it's 1981. Yeah, of course. Yeah, did it say 2012? Sorry about that. Yeah, that was 1981. So obviously, yeah, it's 1981. So if you think, if you frame Rushdie's Midnight's Children at the time, if you're thinking about even like international writing within the UK in that time, England is still very much I would say much more provincial than it is now as regards the literary production. If you look now at the literature within the UK, and you can see there's a plethora of Indian, Caribbean writing, African writing, globalized, while the 1980s, from which Rushdie's writing Midnight's Children in London. He's writing as a diasporan writer. It's very revolutionary. You've got to see it within that context. My next author, now what I'm trying to do here now, because if you've seen what I've done is with my first author is an Indian author who is based in India. Rushdie is very much what we like a global cosmopolitan. So in that sense, also when we're analysing authors, it's interesting to see where they fit within that kind of structure. Having said that, I would even say now there is a deconstruction of what is diasporic Indian writing and local writing. I think even now with the way globalization is happening and the way the kind of delocalization, that category even perhaps might be blurred. Amit Chowdhury. Amit Chowdhury he's from Mumbai, but his cultural roots are Calcutta, and he lives in the UK. He's professor of writing at East Anglia University. Now, I've chosen Chowdhury for his very creative way of dealing with belonging, and I've chosen a book which is known as Strange and Sublime Address. And what Chowdhury does is he revisits his parent city, which is Calcutta, but what he does is he creates this narrator called Sandeep, and what he tries to do is he tries to deconstruct his own sense of idea through his wanderings through Calcutta, through his engagement with the city. And of course this has its parallels with the flaneur tradition of Walter Benjamin in his work Translations. This idea of the European cosmopolitan wandering through the city, and actually the city becomes, if you like, a kind of a text that has to be written. Identity in itself, the I of the actual person wandering the city somehow becomes enmeshed within the actual culture of the city itself. So what Chowdhury does, and he does it on many levels, on a formal level, on a structural level. What he tries to do is he's flagging up his own kind of identity as an Indian who has been brought up in Bombay, who is from a Bengali culture, who then becomes an Indian diasporan in the UK, returns to Calcutta. He's looking at two things. He's looking at the city of Calcutta as a system of signs, and what he does is he meshes that with the actual the letters of Bengali, which he cannot read. Okay, and what they do is that the actual calligraphy, the actual curvatures of Bengali, the script, and the city themselves become two signifiers that actually can't be read. Okay, so what he tries to do also, he tries to deconstruct the senses of reality, his reality and the reality of the city, and how the city, his wandering through the city, transforms his own reality, and also him as a subject who no longer belongs to this city, even though it is the city of his parents, who he has a very strong affectional link towards. So what happens is that reality no longer becomes one kind of story, but it becomes an assemblage of infinite moments and actions and perceptions. Okay, so what happens is that this person is always on the brink of understanding something. There are moments, and then they slip away from him. So Chowdhury is definitely a very interesting person to study if you were interested in looking at contemporary English writing. Also, he's a very accomplished Hindi singer. He's classically trained in Northern Hindi singing. So he brings in his knowledge of classical music, and also he blends classical Hindi music with Western culture. If you log on to he's got a very good web page. If you log on to that, you'll find he writes very good articles, for example, on his relationship, for example, Western singers like Joni Mitchell, or his relation as an Indian with Western culture. Okay, so he's he's quite a rounded intellectual. Another author which I've selected again for his very innovative style is Harry Kunzru. Now I'm going to talk specifically about his latest novel, which is called Gods Without Men. Okay. Now, if we look at Chowdhury and Kunzru are, even though they're coming from very different kinds of backgrounds, Chowdhury is Indian in the sense that he's been brought up in India, while Kunzru is second generation, and I think his father, if I remember rightly, was I think from Agra, but I'm not too sure. But anyway, he's half British, half Indian. So when you're looking at Kunzru's work, his engagement with Indianness is very much located from this kind of delocalized sense of Indianness. Okay, on a formal level, Kunzru and Chowdhury, they're very different styles, but both are striving towards new ways of expressing Indianness. Okay, and Gods Without Men has been categorized as translit. Okay, this is a new kind of it's a new kind of genre where what they're trying to do is somehow to capture, if we like. There are some critics who would now say that we are actually in a post-modern society. Okay, even postmodern now has gone, and we're in a postmodern society. Certainly, what Kunzru is interested in is our relationship with technology, how technology has created the collapsing of time and space. There's like a flattening of time and space. And I would actually say that perhaps this flattening of, or this collapsing of time and space through technology can also be translated onto newer ideas of identity in itself. So even the fact of looking at the difference between diasporic Indians and Indians, that isn't as clearly defined as now. And I think even in our last presentation, we've seen now how in cinema, for example, the idea of the American road movie has been appropriated by an Indian. So the crossover is much more evident. It's not, things aren't as clear cut. In the case of Gods Without Men, what Kunzru is trying to do is first of all, he gender blends, right? Gender blending is an idea where you don't genre blending. What you do is you try to make a miasma of different kinds of genres, and what that's trying to do is trying to mirror our kind of postmodern society. In the case of Gods Without Men, what we have is a multiple of sub-stories that span both space and time, and that are inserted within the narrative, not as flashbacks and not followed in chronological order, but they're done in such a way as we, the reader, are still looking at these events from our modern perspectives, but somehow it tries to show us how all these events, through different kinds of times, are somehow interconnected. So there's like an interconnectedness within the story seen from a modern perspective. So, for example, we might have an 18th century Aragonese monk. We have somebody who's a scientist from the 1950s. Our main character is Jaz Matharu, who is a second generation Punjabi, and what he does, he's a computer analyst, and what he does is he creates this program which is called Walter, which is able to identify the synchronicity of events simultaneously throughout the world. So in a sense, what he's trying to do is what he's trying to do is in a way it's interesting because behind this there's this kind of a sort of a quasi-nearly spiritual kind of element to the narrative, and he tries to see how technology connects us with our spiritual core. And this is something, so, and also there's a continual like pinballing, you know, that the pinballing machine, so there's a continual pinballing of these different narratives happening simultaneously. So what it does, it creates a very kind of strange effect upon the author. Chowdhury does it as well, but in a different kind of way. Kunzru's other books, his first book was called The Impressionist, the second book was called Transformer, and both books, in a way, are looking at Indianness always from different geographical locations, what it means to be, if you like, Indian within the world, and how all these different Indianness are somehow interconnected in very kind of strange ways. Okay, now, moving on to a different kind of narrative. I'm looking now at an author whose name is Min Mukherjee, and in his book it's called The Lies of Others. What Mukherjee, he teaches in East Anglia as well. He was a student of creative writing at East Anglia, and he's still at East Anglia with Chowdhury. What Mukherjee in The Lives of Others is very much focused upon if you like, the two Indias that exist. The India if you like, it's the classical India of so many Indian narratives. That middle class India which Westerners like so much. And what he does is he juxtaposes the story of the Indian family who are called the can't remember now. Well, I'll tell you now in a minute. And it's if you like, it's the classical Indian saga of a family who are owners of wood mills, and after partition, their business goes down. Now, this, if you like, this is what we're looking at here is a classical Vikram Seth narrative of a suitable boy. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy is, if you like, it's the classical narrative about the middle class aspirational Indian family. So it has those elements to it, but it also has other narratives which tell us about the starving peasants of Bengal. So what Mukherjee tries to do is he tries to create as many realities as possible within his stories. So we're getting to see the perspective of the established Indian, if you like, caste structured system, seen through the microcosm of this family. And on the other hand, we're seeing what the, if you like, the underprivileged of the unscheduled castes and those who are outside, if you like, who are outside the whole structures of power. The same idea that we saw in A Train to Pakistan. Also, one of the elements that it's the Ghosh family. That's it. Yeah, it was the Ghosh family. So what Mukherjee also does is he uses one of the classical motifs also within a lot of Indian writing, and that is the idea of the upper class rebel who becomes a revolutionary. So within one of the focuses of The Lies of Other is the story of in this case the Ghosh family, one of the grandsons who takes a part he becomes a member of the Indian Communist Party, the Marxist branch, and then he becomes an activist within the Naxalites. Now, I think if you can see it here, okay. For any of you who would be studying Indian literature, you would need to look up, I haven't time to explain, but basically you would need to look at the whole history of the Naxalite movement, because it's very it's tied up to everything. It's tied up to even to what Victor was talking about the mining problems in the areas in central and eastern India, because a lot of where these mining companies are moving, they're moving usually out tribal peoples, and a lot of the times these Naxalite movements, part of the reason that of the surgence of these revolutionary forces are because of the appropriation of tribal lands, and just generally speaking the kind of injustices. Okay, so what I've done is I've taken I've got 5 minutes, yeah. Okay, right, and I've teamed it up with Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things. This is a classical text. Okay, it's 1997. It was a one and only book, and it won the Booker Prize. Arundhati Roy is also a well-known activist. So actually, from then she hasn't written any more texts. So Arundhati Roy is on a formal level again. So Arundhati Roy's the story, if you like, the narrative frame within A God of Small Things is the love story between Parvan and Valuta, who's a middle class Syrian Christian girl. Okay, so what it does in this case, while in Mukherjee's story, he gives us parallel realities. In Arundhati Roy's book, the reality of the other, okay, the reality of the Dalits is very much just meshed within their consciousness. It's how it kind of the injustices somehow seep in, but it's always seen from the perspective of privilege. Okay. Again, on a what's also Arundhati Roy's text from a formal level is very important, because linguistically we could say she had taken on from Rushdie, and she uses a lot of like flash forward, sideways movement. So the plot is always kind of suggesting this tragedy that we know is going to happen, and that tragedy is the imminent kind of like the fact that you cannot cross the caste line. Okay, right. I'm not going to speak too much about that because I think it's much more accessible. Okay, Amitav Ghosh's A Sea of Poppies. What I'm going to explore here now is the question of the East India Company. Okay, so if you wanted to look at more like historiographical texts, well, Amitav Ghosh's it's called the Ibis trilogy, and the first one of that is called A Sea of Poppies. Okay, and it's set in 1938 in the India. And the interesting thing about Amitav Ghosh is because he's a historian. His books are very well documented, and what we see here again, it becomes an exploration of how the East India Company affects the whole fabric of Indian society. It kind of signals the end of the Zamdar culture. That's like the culture of the ruling classes, and how also the fact that the farmers, the traders, and how everybody is caught up within this web of like opium-fueled imperial greed. Okay, so his text becomes like a microcosm of colonial Indian society. From a formal level, it's written very much in it's very kind of linear kind of narrative, but the linguistic elements that are a little bit more, if you like, a bit more experimental is through his use of code switching, what he calls Bhasha. So what Ghosh does is he has in-line words from colonial India that both are used both by the characters and also by the English characters, and there are no English equivalents, and they're used quite frequently, and it takes us a while to actually understand what they are. So that's the kind of, if you like, the innovative kind of element of his text. And I've paired this up with Jeet Dahil's Narcopolis. Okay, so while if you read them side by side, they're interesting, because while Ghosh's text is historical, Dahil looks at the opium culture in the 1970s in Bombay. Okay, now so if you Jeet Dahil is very much for me, he's very much like the kind of 1960s counterculture movement in the United States, in the formal, in not in the formal way he writes, but in the material. In Indian writing, it's not. Oh, even though sometimes certain Indian writing can be transgressive, there are certain things that still are a little bit taboo, and Tahil in his book is transgressive in the kind of taboos that he takes on, and that is very much evident in the way that the Indian press first of all received Narcopolis. It was totally slighted. Afterwards, it was actually shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and it won the South Asian Awards. On a linguistic level, on a formal level, the book is very innovative, because what he actually does is he uses the motif of the opium pipe as being a generator of narratives. So what you get is this kind of elliptic, narcotic kind of narrative that induces us into a kind of a narcotic state ourselves. A lot of times the narrator doesn't know at what side of reality we are. On a social level, it's also an interesting text, because what it does is it documents the kind of more freer kind of ambience in Bombay in the 1970s, where religious communalism wasn't so evident. And then what it does is it fast forwards into modern time, when first of all opium culture dies out, and now what you have is heroin culture, low-grade Pakistani heroin culture, and also how religious fundamentalism is rising again in India. How being like Hinduvata or these kind of radical affiliations with Islam, and so on and so forth. So they're kind of two texts that are very different, but I've paired them together because they are complementary. Okay, and just to finish off my brief kind of introduction, I've looked at another element of Indian writing, which is like rife writing. And I've chosen Vikram Seth's his book, which was called A Half a Life. Okay, and what Seth does is, because Vikram Seth, when he went to live in England, he went to live with his uncle Shanu and Shanu's wife Henny, who was Jewish German. So it's what he actually does is, in a way, he documents the story of his uncle Shanu, and how Shanu was a dentist who was studying in Berlin during the rise of fascism, and then he moved to England with his wife Henny, who had to leave Germany because she was a German Jew. But he also, it's interesting because what he also does is he uses the narrative or the story of his uncle to explore in a sense his own identity. Okay, and what he tries to do also, what's interesting is he's giving us an example of a bicultural, racial relationship at a time when supposedly that wasn't very common. And the interesting thing is, apart from certain kind of superficial differences, they were a couple who really, there wasn't any, if you like, cultural differences. They were very, it's quite interesting to see how, in actual fact, just through day-to-day existence, between an Indian living in Britain and a German Jew, they were quite capable of like finding bridges between their different cultures. Because life writing, one of the vehicles that are used, and we'll be seeing this in Qurayshis, is that Seth discovers a file of letters. So he discovers letters. It's the classical, you open a box in the attic and there's all these letters. So what he does is, because Seth, what he did was he interviewed his uncle, but then his uncle died, and then he thought that he didn't have enough material. But then when he found these box of letters, he was able to construct a whole kind of narrative. Okay, so life writing is actually becoming very, very popular within diasporic Indian studies. It's like there's there are, if you will find, I can tell you afterwards, we can have a discussion on it, but it's another kind of genre that is gaining a lot of prevalence within the Indian writing. Okay, and the last one is Hanif Qureshi. Right, it's called actually no, I didn't put the title here, it's called My Ear at His Heart, and which was written, when was it written? Can't remember now, but it was 2000 and something. Anyway, in this case, it's different because Seth is first generation Indian going to Britain. Qureshi is looking at it from the other way. He's negotiating his Britishness, Pakistani Englishness, and he's looking at the figure of his father, who is a failed writer. So again, in this case, the frame is Qureshi finds in his agents, he finds an old lost novel of his father, and his father had been attempting all his life to write a novel. So he uses the discovery of this manuscript, which is called An Indian Adolescence, which features his father talking about his son. And in a sense, what he tries to do is, through his reassessment of his father and of the relationship, the filial relationship, he's trying to somehow, it becomes a kind of an exercise of self-analysis. And that's something, the other book I was thinking about was the making of Mr. High. There's another book called A Muslim Boy Meets the West. There are so many of these kind of narratives, and they're all a lot, because they're life writing. They usually frame this narrative within the family, which is very important, and always look at this kind of if you like, the tryst between first and second generation, and use it as a way. It's kind of like life writing, because we must also remember, though, that even though it is life writing, and it's, if you like, life writing as compared to autobiographical, life writing is different. What you actually do is you create a narrator that you give as, I am Hanif Qureshi, but I am this narrator. So in a sense, life writing is a fictionalized version of reality, okay? So it's another, if you like, it's another avenue for research. If you were looking to look for another way, an inroad into Indian studies, well, life writing is another good way. Okay, I think I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much.